This is section 19, which is actually the next to last section for the entire air freight module. In both of the remaining sections, we're going to talk about best practices for U.S. importers working with air freight forwarders. If you took the ocean module, which was module 6, the format of these slides should look pretty familiar because they're based on the concept of supplier relationship management, which is something we went through in module 6 on ocean freight. We're going to use the same framework, this time applying it, obviously, to air freight forwarders. U.S. importers should seek to work with air freight forwarders that can enhance their overall value proposition and make them more competitive in global markets. This is the same statement we made in Module 6 because the same principle applies. U.S. importers should work with forwarders not just to incur expenses for shipping, but to seek competitive advantage on landed cost benefits, on transportation lead time advantages, both short lead times but stable lead times, and working with freight forwarders to create an enhanced element of customer service, not just for the importer, but also for the overseas suppliers. This bullet echoes, both explicitly and implicitly, the 4 objectives of supply chain management. Maximize sales opportunities, drive down and control landed costs, shorten and stabilize cumulative lead times, and optimize inventory levels. Air freight forwarders can play a role in achieving all of those goals. We as the importer have to harness the capabilities of the forwarders to our advantage. With that said, second bullet point, air freight forwarders should be subject to the same vetting procedures that importers use to work with other vendors, product vendors, other service providers, etc. Trade tip, it's the same one we saw in Module 6. Some of the verbiage has changed. Best practices in supplier relationship management, SRM, can be applied to the importer-air freight forwarder relationship. Let's see how. When developing an SRM approach to the importer-forwarder relationship, U.S. companies should investigate areas that include corporate structure. We're talking about the freight forwarders now. What is the structure? Is it a sole proprietorship of a local forwarder that we wish to work with? Is it a publicly traded company with 80,000 employees around the world and hundreds of offices? These are not exaggerated numbers. A corporate structure of a forwarder could be a sole proprietorship with 10 people in an office in Cleveland, Ohio, or a multinational publicly traded company with 80,000 employees and hundreds of offices around the world. We need to know what the structure is. What is the financial stability of the air freight forwarder? Now, IATA, through its accreditation process, establishes an element of financial stability, so that's a good sign on the air freight side of things. Sometimes it's difficult to ascertain financial stability, especially for privately held companies. It's a lot easier for publicly traded 3PLs, freight forwarders, because their financial statements are publicly available. How long has a company been in business? Where do they have U.S. office locations? As an air freight forwarder, might it be reasonable to think that said forwarder has operations in every major U.S. gateway? The ones we talked about at least, LAX, Dallas, Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Miami, maybe others. Maybe it matters to us, maybe it doesn't. Maybe we as an importer only bring goods into LA and we're really not that interested in other office locations. We want to establish where they are so we know what we're dealing with. Last bullet here. What's the total square footage of each office and warehouse operation? Which, of course, is important from an air freight perspective, the ability to physically handle cargo. Some others to consider. Because we are looking at things from the perspective of a U.S. importer, we want to work with forwarders and customs brokers too that have a good infrastructure in the U.S., but of equal if not greater importance, what do they look like overseas? In the origin regions or cities from which we are importing? Do they have owned offices in Latin America? Do they work with agents in Africa? Those are the questions we want to answer. We're not here to be a proponent of either owned offices or agents. What we are saying is ascertain what the infrastructure is. How many employees does the company have? Is it a union shop versus a non-union shop? We are agnostic when it comes to pointing out any differences between a union and a non-union shop. But it's important to know from a structural perspective especially when contracts come up for renegotiation and operations run the risk of being shut down? That's a reasonable question to ask. What's the level of operational expertise of employees? We talked about this way back in Module 6 when we stated that most freight forwarders, at least in the very beginning of their operations, came from a specific area of expertise. ABC Freight Forwarder is known for being a good ocean forwarder. XYZ Forwarder is known for being a good air freight forwarder. That doesn't mean that companies can't acquire additional expertise, but what is the core expertise of the organization and how good are they at air freight? What's the geographic focus of the company? We talked about this too. Companies that specialize in imports from Latin America. Companies that specialize in exports to Asia. Every company has its origins, both geographically and operationally. We want to find out what they are now and what they were in the early days. A couple of others: the level of expertise in trade compliance. And compliance can take on a couple of different meanings. Could be operational compliance, labeling for dangerous goods, for example, if we are an importer of dangerous goods. U.S. import trade compliance, any variety of things. What is the level of expertise in trade compliance of a forwarder that we might be looking at to work with? What's the average years of tenure per employee? Employee tenure, or how long they've been with the company, is a good sign not only of stability, but a corporate culture that keeps people working with the same company. 10 years, 5 years, 15 years. This is important in the freight forwarding industry because for whatever reason, and either fortunately or unfortunately, the freight forwarding space, the 3PL space, is well known for high levels of job hopping, where people will stay a couple years here and move on, a couple years there and move on. We want to ask this question and hopefully get a truthful answer about it because it is indicative of the capabilities of the company. Type and level of any outsourcing of activities. As it relates to freight forwarding for air freight, probably the best example of this is an air freight forwarder that works through a master loader at origin, a term that we defined at the very front end of this module. Does the freight forwarder do their own consolidations from origin? Do they work through a master loader? That's just one example of outsourcing, but it's an important one. We should think about all of them. And from an air freight perspective, last sub-bullet point, a critical question to ask is if the forwarder has IATA accreditation, the International Air Transport Association. We want to know if they're part of that global air freight ecosystem. Really, they have to be, but we want to ask the question anyway and see what kind of answer we get. We're going to stop here and break the topic of working with air freight forwarders down into 2 sections. The next one, number 20, being the final. So do come back quickly and we'll wrap up what has been a pretty comprehensive treatment of inbound air freight.